Almost any time you hear music, whether it be via traditional AM/FM radio, music streaming service like Pandora, or in a movie or television show, someone had to pay someone else for the right to play that music. The question of who to pay is often difficult to answer. In this video, we explain the ins and outs of music licensing. Catherine Oyama of Google has a nice summary of our current music licensing system.
I think it's probably fair to say if any of us were sitting down today to construct a system, it wouldn't look like the one we have today, right? It's very fragmented, very opaque, and legislation has been tacked on over time as new ways of distribution were created. So it doesn't surprise me that people on many different sides feel some sense of unfairness.
Our current fragmented system of intellectual property protection of music began in 1831 with copyright protection of sheet music, known as composition rights, and the public performance of that music, or performance rights, in the late 1800s. With player pianos and music recordings came the extension of copyright protection to the physical reproduction of copies and recorded music, referred to as mechanical rights, which included cassette tapes, CDs, and now digital downloads. The growing popularity of public performances and over-the-air broadcasting in the early 20th century meant that copyright holders couldn't easily license music and collect the royalties they were owed on their own. Thus, the first performance rights organization, or PRO, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, generally known as ASCAP, was formed to make these tasks more efficient. Soon after, another PRO, Broadcast Music Incorporated, or BMI, was established. Dale Collins, adjunct professor of law at the NYU School of Law, explains how blanket licenses and centralized licensing functions did reduce transactions costs, but also led to antitrust and competition concerns.
The transactions costs can be so overwhelming that in the first instance, for example, the market just doesn't even develop. I mean, that is the reason why ASCAP formed in the beginning. To overcome the transactions cost, there was aggregation of the rights. And then ASCAP became so powerful that there was the view that ASCAP had market power. And what really happened with ASCAP to start the 1941 consent decree is there was a fight between ASCAP and the radio stations, and there was what basically was called the ASCAP boycott. And on December 31st, 1940, all the ASCAP music got pulled off the air. The antitrust division sued to solve a market failure.
Antitrust suits brought against ASCAP and BMI resulted in a series of consent decrees issued by the U.S. Department of Justice Antitrust Division. The decrees, and subsequent modifications by the DOJ, act as a de facto set of regulatory rules for license terms, including pricing, for musical compositions. Royalties are paid to songwriters as illustrated in this chart. PROs issue blanket licenses to distributors or other organizations that want to play music, with fees set by the rate courts specified in the DOJ consent decrees, and distribute royalties to rights holders. Congress attempted to address the impact of the digital revolution on music distribution with the Digital Performance Rights and Sound Recordings Act in 1995 and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998. These acts expanded copyright protection to public performances of sound recordings through digital transmissions. For performance rights, terrestrial radio and certain other venues like restaurants do not pay sound recording royalties. Non-interactive digital transmission platforms like Pandora's radio service, in which listeners do not select the songs they hear, obtain blanket licenses from Sound Exchange. Fees are determined by two different standards: the 801B standard, which is usually lower, and a willing buyer, willing seller standard, which is usually higher, depending on if the service existed prior to 1998. Interactive digital transmission services like Spotify, where listeners do select the songs they hear, negotiate terms directly with the rights owners. The current system has generated a series of conflicts between rights holders and distributors. As Daniel Rubenfeld from the NYU School of Law explains, increasing market share of new media has made it harder for labels and traditional media to keep their profit margins.
In terms of royalty rates, rates have generally been increasing. From the point of view of the labels, are still very low, but they have been increasing. And from the point of view of the services, that's a substantial cost because it's a significant part of their business.
He argues that the regulatory framework has prevented market forces from correcting the problem.
Significant constraints come from some of the statutory history of the past, free terrestrial, the fact that YouTube generally is offering music which is not paying royalties, and of course the constraint from piracy, which is something that the industry has had a lot of difficulty controlling. Finally, more and more royalty arrangements have been negotiated in the statute of the statutory rates or in the statute of the consent decree with DOJ. And so when you have a world that more and more negotiations depend on the statutory overlay, that raises interesting questions about how the statutes and the consent decree should evolve.
Disparities in rate classifications between licensors and platforms compound this problem, meaning platforms have to pay different rates despite having functionally convergent services.
There has been functional convergence between statutory and on-demand services. If you happen to be a Pandora user, if you work hard at it, you can actually get to play the song you really want. On the other hand, if you're a Spotify user, where you do get to pick your songs, you can actually create stations in a way that's very similar to what Pandora can do.
Stephen Marks of the Recording Industry Association of America adds,
if, for example, I am, a company like Spotify, or some competitor of a company like YouTube, or a competitor of Pandora's, and they're operating under one of these government-sanctioned subsidies, I cannot compete in the same way, or that they can. So when I'm in a negotiation with a rights holder, the first thing that I'm going to bring up is, well, wait a second, I'm offering essentially the same service that YouTube is offering, yet they're only paying X.
As Stephen Marks notes, these market distortions hit the artists themselves especially hard.
If you look at the kind of convergence that exists that Dan was talking about, where some of those services are availing themselves of the statutory license and others are not able to, all of those things are interfering and indeed distorting, I think, what we would think is a fair market. And I think if you drill down into each of those, you can see how that's happening, and actually the money that's being lost, at least on the creator side, in the billions of dollars.
If the market is indeed failing for this reason, then the fix should be fairly straightforward, as Brad Prendergast of Sound Exchange argues.
We want to see a terrestrial performance right in place. We want to see that the rate standard that digital music services have when rates are set under the statutory license is uniform across the board. It should be a fair market value standard, a willing buyer, willing seller standard for all services, instead of some services taking advantage of the 801B factors to realize below market rates.
Fixing a market failure is crucial for creating an efficient market. Catherine Oyama suggests that increased transparency in the licensing system could promote fairness in an otherwise fragmented and opaque system.
How do we make the system more fair for everyone? And there's a couple places where I think you have some consensus coalescing. One would be transparency, so that all people looking from all different perspectives are looking at the same information. Because of the way the copyright system has evolved, there is no, single, authoritative, comprehensive, accurate place where someone that wants to license music and pay for music can go and know who to pay.
Increased transparency would lead to more stakeholders having better information, and better information usually leads to a more efficient market. A potential way to increase transparency would be through digitization of the music licensing system itself. Digitization has revolutionized the way consumers purchase, stream, and listen to music, and it could do the same to licensing and payment arrangements as well. Electronic monitoring systems can reduce transactions costs, which motivated the current system in the first place. Jacqueline Charlesworth, General Counsel and Associate Register of Copyrights at the U.S. Copyright Office, discussed a recent report released by her office on possible reforms to music licensing, including creating a centralized comprehensive database.
On the musical work side, we heard a lot about split works and so forth. You have multiple entities operating under different government regimes. We have the PROs, who are regulated by the federal rate courts, who each have important data sets in terms of the publishers and songwriters they represent. And then you have the Harry Fox Agency, now part of CSAC, which has a database relating to mechanical rights. And unfortunately, these sort of sets of data tend to be fairly siloed. It would be extraordinarily beneficial to have an authoritative public database.
Developing the database would require creating what Charlesworth called music rights organizations, which would combine information on mechanical and performance rights.
We also recommended that the entities who were administering statutory licensing, which we called music rights organizations, we recommended that they be able to take on mechanical rights, and potentially other rights as well, and rename them MROs, that those organizations would take at least the key elements of data of the songs that they represent and submit them to a public database that would be operated by what we call the General MRO.
A recent paper by TPI Senior Fellow and President Emeritus Tom Leonard and NYU's Larry White suggested that creating such a database is necessary to help move the regime away from collective arrangements and towards competition and market efficiencies. At the event, White explained how a particular safe harbor agreement and moving away from mandatory licensing could make the centralized database possible.
If we're going to have this database, we need the incentives, as Jacqueline mentioned, to get people to contribute. One strong incentive would be the following safe harbor. A distributor makes a good faith effort to search a centralized database. If the distributor does not find an ownership piece of information and goes ahead and plays the piece of music anyway, the distributor cannot be sued. Once you have mandatory licensing, you gotta have regulation, because if I've got a statutory right to play your music, I'm gonna say, and I'll pay you, 0.05 of a cent to play it, and you're gonna say, no, you want $5 for the right, and somebody's got to adjudicate that.
For a more complete treatment of the issues and suggested improvements to the music licensing regime, it's worth viewing all three discussion panels. We link to them, as well as Leonard and White's paper, below. I'm Pert Happy.